The attorneys defending the boy charged with savagely stabbing his younger sister.
Barney Fowler is Leila Fowler's father. He was the first person to run inside their Valley Springs home.
Healing from the way Leila died, stabbed to death inside her home.
It does not happen to a person you know.
12-year-old brother who was home with. Again, police have made no arrests in this.
Really, it's that common.
Yeah, unfortunately.
It's all about winning, man.
So, here we are. The video a lot of you guys were waiting for. Let's begin. 2 days after I posted the video on the Leila Fowler case, I received an email that immediately got my attention. The subject read Leila Fowler, and well, the email starts like this. Hi, my name is Barney Fowler. I am Leila and Isaiah Fowler's father, and he goes on to say that he was given the link to my video. He says he didn't watch it, but that his wife, Crystal, has. They didn't have any issues with the video except that the information I shared were coming from news articles. Now, I'll admit reading this email I thought maybe this was fake. I think it's because I was shocked that they had reached out to me so quickly. Again, it has only been 2 days. When I logged onto Twitter, I got a tweet that said this. This is Leila and Isaiah Fowler's oldest brother. And that brother is Justin Fowler. We exchanged a few messages and he eventually told me this. We actually look at everyone's video because sadly that is the only publicity it gets. A lot of it is negative unfortunately, but we try our best to educate the public on what really happened and how the case was handled. My family is more than willing to answer any questions you may have. Okay, so now it made sense to me how they found my video so quickly. This may not be 100% proof, but I decided to move forward and respond back to Barney that I'll be willing to do a follow-up. Before that, Barney did mention a few things he wanted to clear up. I would like to clear up something my wife pointed out. Leila's biological mother was not allowed to see the kids because she was a drug addict. It had nothing to do with money. She stopped living with the kids when Leila was 1 and Isaiah was 5. There are court documents. And the other thing is that Isaiah was not always left to babysit Leila, occasionally for a few minutes while I ran to the local store. That morning, Leila chose to stay home and asked her brother to stay with her. I can go on and on, but I just wanted to reach out and say thank you for getting my daughter's story out there. All we have ever wanted was the truth as to what happened to her. Unfortunately, the court trials left us with more questions than answers. At the end of the email, he attached a YouTube link which was a 2-hour interview with Isaiah's attorney and private investigator. This is when I made the community post asking you, the viewers, to comment whatever questions you may have for the Fowler family. Unfortunately, I got busy with life and submitted the questions in late of June. It was my fault for sending the questions later than I intended, and because of that, I decided to give them 1 month to respond. I thought that was a fair amount of time. However, a month goes by and I never got a response. Not from the parents, nor from Justin. But I watched a 2-hour interview, and if it wasn't for this interview, this video wouldn't have been possible, as it did answer the majority of the questions you guys had asked. Before I start, I want to say this. If you haven't seen the original video, go watch it so there's no confusion. And lastly, whether you believe Isaiah is innocent or not, please try to watch with an open mind. That's all. And if you thought this case was crazy before, well, get ready, because it gets worse. At the start of the interview, we see John, the private investigator, on the left and Mark, the attorney, on the right. Right off the bat, Mark says the two have been working on this case for 7 years for free. Now, this interview was in late 2020, so I assume it's safe to say that they have been working on it for 8 years as of now. John says he used to wake up every morning and look at arrest records from the Calaveras County and 2 other nearby counties, hoping to find anyone that could possibly fit the description given by Isaiah and the witness who recanted later on. They gave out a detailed description of what happened on that day. So, here it goes. At 7 a.m., Barney and Crystal wanted to go to a little league game that was approximately 5 minutes away from their home. The parents had initially asked Leila if she wanted to go with them and she agreed, but right before they were about to leave, she changes her mind. So the parents woke Isaiah to let him know that he's going to be taking care of his sister while they're gone for a while. So time goes by and Leila calls Crystal that Isaiah was still sleeping, so Crystal tells her to wake him up. Minutes later, she gets called again, but this time it's Isaiah. He tells her that Leila has a headache, to which Crystal told him to give her some Tylenol. Isaiah made pancakes for him and his little sister and sent pictures of it to his stepmom. This all took place between 7 and 10:30 a.m. At 10:45 a.m., he calls Crystal again, and this time he says Leila is bored and doesn't know what to do. She tells him to put on a movie, so the two kids watched it at the living room. The movie was How to Eat Fried Worms, Leila's favorite movie. Isaiah says they watched it all the way through, and once it was over, he puts the movie away in a shelf and goes to the bathroom. At this point, it was around noonish. Seconds later, as Isaiah was in the bathroom, he hears a man yelling out, "Come on out, I know you're in there," and banging on the walls. Isaiah then hears his sister yelling. Isaiah cracks open the door enough to see what was going on. This is when he sees the intruder on top of Leila in her room. He steps out of the bathroom, and when the intruder saw Isaiah, the intruder ran out of the house while Isaiah chased him out. He then calls Crystal, telling her that he saw someone hitting Leila. Crystal hangs up and immediately calls 911. The parents race back home and see Isaiah still on the phone with 911 on the front porch. According to Mark, Isaiah sounded very scared in the call. Barney goes into Leila's room, picks her up, and walks back to the front porch. Seconds later, the police and ambulance had arrived. Barney was completely soaked in his daughter's blood. Mark says blood was just everywhere. It got in several places in the house while Barney was bringing her outside. It even got on Crystal, but there was no blood on Isaiah. A sheriff tried to perform CPR on Leila on the front steps of the house, and was then replaced by an EMT who then took over. However, a few hours later, Leila was pronounced dead at the hospital. Neither of the two who performed CPR on Leila ever mentioned at the moment whether she was warm or cold to the touch, which goes to time of death. I've mentioned in my last video that Leila's blood was found underneath the handle of one of the kitchen steak knives, but none of the knives at the house was the murder weapon. None of them matched the stabbing wounds. Why was Leila's blood there? Well, that remains a mystery. Some speculated that maybe Leila got hurt accidentally playing or touching the knife that day, but Crystal said there's no way. If she had gotten hurt the knife earlier that morning, she would have known. So, police had their eyes on Isaiah and interviewed him twice that day. The first time was right outside the house when police first arrived, and in that interview, Isaiah had told police what he saw. A man that was about 6 feet tall, long grayish hair, Hispanic, and had a strong Hispanic accent. Then the second interview took place at the police station to get a better understanding of his side of the story. Barney wasn't there with Isaiah. According to Mark, the police tried their very best to make sure Barney was not in there and allow Isaiah to get any type of support. Mark was able to listen to the audio recording of the interrogation. Police tell Isaiah that they found DNA evidence on him and that no one in the area had seen the person that he described. Mark says that the police kept asking Isaiah to repeat his story of what happened over and over again, hoping that it would confuse Isaiah and have him change his story. But Isaiah remained consistent with his story. The police had looked at Isaiah's hands and his hands were clean. By clean, I mean there was no blood on him, but his fingers were dirty and had grime under his fingernails, which Mark argues that this proves that he didn't try washing his hands to get rid of any blood. Not only that, but Isaiah didn't have any cuts on his hands, which Mark had pointed out that it's uncommon for someone to have done a stabbing and not have any cuts on their hands. Another thing I want to make clear is when Isaiah mentioned that he saw his sister getting hit, that's not an unusual statement. Mark had pointed out the many stabbing cases he had seen in his 15 years as a public defender. Many witnesses of a stabbing crime has said the same thing. They saw the victim get hit, only to find out that the victim was stabbed. So Isaiah was let go that same day. The next day, Barney wanted to talk to the police. He says he's willing to do anything to help find the killer of his daughter, so he reveals this to the police. When he lived in Stockton, just 40 miles southwest from Valley Springs, he spent many years selling methamphetamine in Stockton with the Mexican Mafia. They asked how much he was making selling drugs to them, and Barney said around $500,000 every 6 months. Barney admits he made that amount because he constantly kept ripping them off or stole some of their drugs. He says he was their guy when it came to moving and selling their drugs, and then it went bad. So Barney wanted to get out of the business. As a result, he moved to Valley Springs to get away from it all. He was willing to share anything and didn't care if he would get in trouble for it, as long as it helps them find the killer. 2 weeks have gone by and Isaiah was interviewed a few more times again, and Mark says he was interviewed against his will. He even says that the police had already listed Isaiah as the suspect since day one and were trying to get Isaiah to confess. Another 2 weeks go by and police came back to interview Isaiah. Barney tells Isaiah as much as he hates the police, it's best to trust and cooperate with the police because they'll be honest with them. Isaiah was interviewed at their house by a police officer, county detective, and an FBI agent. The police said that they wanted to help him and told him if he just admits to the murder, he can say that he is sick and that he would get help. Then the FBI agent told Isaiah that they've already analyzed a 911 call using this new science technology that can tell anyone whether someone is guilty or not. This is when Isaiah says this: "I guess I did it, but I don't remember doing it. But if you're telling me I did, I guess I did, but I don't think I did. I didn't do it." And this is what the police were waiting for. What Isaiah said was enough for the police to consider it as a confession, and Isaiah was arrested and charged. Before getting cuffed, he hugs his dad and tells him that he didn't do it, to which Barney responded, "I know you didn't, son." So police searched all of his electronic devices and they found nothing. Police had taken every single traps, pipes, and drains from every sink and the shower to find any evidence of blood, and it all came back negative. No indication of blood or any evidence of bleach or any other cleaning products being used. The police couldn't find any physical evidence that could link Isaiah to the murder of his sister, and the only thing they had on him as of now was his confession. As I mentioned earlier, the police believed Isaiah to be the suspect since the very first day, so if you remember on the last video during the investigation, before Isaiah was arrested, the police had told the people of Valley Springs that they're not in danger. Candace DeLong said that she believes that the police had made that statement because they already knew who the suspect was, and she was right. John had mentioned that on the night of the murder, a coroner from Stockton had arrived to perform an autopsy. During the autopsy, he was given 2 knives that had blood including the rest of the steak knives from the house and asked, could any of these be the murder weapon? Which the coroner responded with, "No, they don't look like a match. Take those away, they can't be the murder weapon." The coroner had mentioned that he agreed with Mark and John that the murder took place around 11:50 a.m. to around 12 p.m. It had to have happened fast and the intruder left shortly before the police and parents had arrived. But weeks later after the murder had happened, Mark says the coroner had received an email from the county sheriff saying, "Dear doctor, we know you said this can't be the murder weapon. We want you to know that Leila's blood was found inside the handle, so would you recalculate your professional opinion?" And the coroner did exactly that. John says it was one of the first 2 times that they tried to manipulate the coroner into changing his mind. Since Isaiah was 12, remember that in California, if you commit a crime like this and you're under the age of 14, you don't get a jury, so it's up to the judge. Isaiah, now 15, did a polygraph right before his first trial, and not only did he pass, but his charts were so high for truthfulness that it surprised the interviewer. The interview was 6 hours long. Apparently it's very common for teenagers to always fail. However, when his first trial came, the judge didn't even bother to look at it. Polygraph tests aren't admissible in court. However, in California it can be, but not unless all parties agree to admit it into evidence. Both the DA and judge disagreed. Isaiah was then found guilty, and the reason was because of Isaiah's confession and statements that were made in many interviews, which were later deemed inadmissible because of the amount of lies that were thrown at Isaiah just to get him to confess. Then 2 years later they won the appeal for a second trial. Isaiah had a different judge this time that Marks considered to be worse than the one from the first trial. An expert in crime scene reconstruction had admitted that whoever the killer is, they would have to be covered in blood. They also believed Leila had to be carried from the top bunk of her bed and down on the floor. The DA had her own expert who believed the same thing, but the DA ignored their opinion and said Leila had jumped off the bed after getting stabbed multiple times already. The DA also never explained as to why there was no blood on Isaiah. Remember, when his father had picked up Leila, her blood got everywhere and yet there was no evidence of blood on Isaiah. John says the court had accepted that luminol is a determinative test. Luminol was sprayed down the corridor and throughout the house, and the only thing interesting they could find was the footprints of Barney when he was carrying Leila to the front porch. No other footprints could be found, so the two believe that the killer quickly got in and out. But the DA believes it's Isaiah since he was the one in the house. However, they wouldn't accept the fact that if Isaiah couldn't have left any footprints, then the intruder could have done the same thing. An important thing that was brought up by John was that they received a copy of the 911 call, including the full transcript. In the call, Isaiah was asked by the 911 operator what the intruder was wearing, and Isaiah said he was wearing black, but the DA had a different version of the call. In the DA's version, Isaiah says the intruder was black. The DA says that in the 911 call, Isaiah goes back and forth saying the intruder is black and Hispanic, but Isaiah never mentions any of that. Isaiah described the intruder to a police officer when they first arrived at the scene, not through the call. Now, how did two versions of the 911 call even happen? They don't know. Not only that, but they also can't explain why the judge rejected Mark and John's version of the call. The judge didn't even bother listening to it. Instead, he accepted the DA's version of the 911 call. The DA also argued of Isaiah's claim that he supposedly chased the intruder out of the house. Mark argued that Isaiah made that claim so he didn't feel like a coward because Isaiah being the older brother, he didn't want the world thinking he was hiding when his job as an older brother is to protect their little sister. So because the police and the DA believed he lied about that, it means he's lying about everything else and is in fact the killer. But Mark says just because it's not true, it doesn't mean Isaiah is the killer. It just means Isaiah had weak survivor skills. They got the deputy sheriff on the stand, the same sheriff who performed CPR on Leila, and when asked how did Leila feel, he responded that she was cold to the touch. And then they got the EMT on the stand who said the same thing. She was cold to the touch. But the same EMT said something different in his report. While Leila was at the hospital, he fills out the report and in the report he mentions that she was warm to the touch. In the same report, there's a thing one must fill out, which is CRT, capillary refill time. What this is, if you pinched a nail on any of your fingers, it will turn white and should immediately turn pink once let go. A normal CRT is 1 to 2 seconds. This indicates normal blood volume and perfusion. Anything longer than 2 seconds suggests poor perfusion. In the report, the EMT says Leila's CRT was less than 2 seconds, which indicates that blood is still pumping. When the coroner was on the stand, he is now saying that the murder happened around 10:45 a.m. during the time of the two watching the movie, and when asked 4 times if it's possible Leila may have died shortly before the police had arrived, he said no, and that nothing would change his mind. So now, Mark and John present them the report from the EMT. They told him to read the report out loud where it says that she was warm to the touch, and John says that the color on the coroner's face started to change. The coroner read where her CRT was less than 2 seconds, and when asked, is this the equivalent of a living human being? The coroner looked directly at the DA in disgust and said, yeah, it is. He then looks at the judge and says, Your Honor, I've never seen this report. The next day the EMT comes in again and says, I didn't really fill out that report. I didn't read it closely enough. My intern filled it out. An expert of fingerprints had taken fingerprints in the house, and of course, the fingerprints matched with everyone who lived in that house. But there were 2 fingerprints that they found that didn't match with anyone. One was on the doorway leading to Leila's room, and the second was on the door frame. John says the DA was stuck as to why she never had it in her report, to which the DA says it's not in her report because she only left it in her notes. John says that no one asked if the fingerprint is consistent of a child or an adult. Now, one important thing I want to mention before going forward with the trial is this. Some of you may remember the stock market crash back in 2007 to 2008, so this was post 2008. The financial crisis left a lot of houses in the area going through foreclosure. 2 houses down from the Fowler's home, there was an abandoned house. 2 teenage girls who were friends of Isaiah wanted to go inside and explore. The 2 girls had asked Isaiah if he wanted to come along, but he refused. So the 2 girls had gone inside and said that they saw a lot of trash, empty boxes of crackers on the kitchen counter, and toilet paper filling up the toilet. Then the 2 entered the master bedroom. There was a TV, and it was on, and it was just playing noise. But from an open attic, the two teenage girls heard someone yell in a deep, raspy voice,
Get out of here!
and they took off, and one of them told her mother, to which she called the police. The police showed up and nobody was found. So now we're back in 2013. When Mark and John first started working on the case, they went around the area and approached the abandoned house. To their surprise, the doors were still unlocked. A neighbor by the name of Chris had approached them and asked what they were doing here. Mark and John introduced themselves and told him who they were and why they were here. John told Chris the story of the two girls that were here, to which the neighbor responded in anger and yelled at them saying,
That's bullshit! Yelling in my face. Bullshit! Total bullshit! I take care of this house. I'm the caretaker. I run it for the bank and I do some of the other houses, and that's bullshit. I thought it was
They were surprised by the neighbor's anger and they left it at that. So in trial, the DA brought a woman who said she never heard or seen anyone come out of the house that afternoon. This woman was Chris's partner. She was outside mowing her lawn and didn't hear any screaming or saw anyone run out of the house. But Mark and John were able to prove that not only would she not hear it because she was running a lawnmower at the time, but they were able to prove that she lived too far away. Even being at her front yard, she can't see the house. Mark says they had someone scream in Leila's room to determine how far one can hear the screams. Mark says that they could barely hear it from the front porch. The woman tried to claim that her dogs didn't bark, so that also proves that no one ran outside. But again, this was able to be proven false with the facts already mentioned. John did mention that he didn't think of this till years later, that maybe the dog would have barked if it was someone they knew, not some random stranger running by. Well, the woman was on the stand and two guys were in court seated, one being Chris and next to him was a much younger guy. John says the younger guy was leaning forward on edge the entire time the woman was on the stand. When the woman was done, she walked out. The DA called for a recess and the DA and her associate and paralegal all ran out. According to Mark, Chris was yelling right at the DA's face, which left her backed up against the wall in fear, and they were able to hear her say in a soft voice,
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
John says Chris was absent during the day of the murder, and his absence was never explained. This dog argument, where have we heard it before? Remember the neighbor Don who said the same thing about not seeing anyone running out of the Fowler's home and that his dogs never barked? Remember, he says his dog would bark anytime someone would walk down that street, but that day, he says his dog was silent.
Nobody came out that door, plain and simple. I got a German wolf, 95 pounds. Every time somebody walks down that street, they start barking. When this all happened, there was no barks. Nothing.
John didn't want to mention Chris's name when telling the story, but Mark revealed it anyways when brought up again near the ending of the interview. Before the name was revealed, my immediate thought that this neighbor that they were talking about was Don, but now I'm not too sure. Still, I wanted to bring that up. If you remember from the last video, I mentioned that there was a male hair found on Leila's body. Well, I was wrong on that. There was hair found in her underwear, but it was her hair. However, there was male DNA found on it, and it could only come from 3 sources: blood, semen, and saliva. Saliva was instantly eliminated as it carries a particular enzyme that wasn't present in the DNA. They also eliminated the idea of it being semen, as there was no evidence that Leila was sexually assaulted. The DNA did not match with anyone in the house or anyone nearby. They tried to present it in the trial, but the prosecutor said that the DNA is a random thing. They submitted the DNA to CODIS. The DA suspected that the DNA could possibly match with a male relative from Barney's side of the family, but there was no match. John says that they wanted to retest the DNA found on Leila and the unidentified fingerprint and see if those two were coming from the same person. The point of this is to eliminate the argument that DA had, which was the DNA are completely random and aren't related to the crime. But the second judge had denied the motion of the hearing for the DNA, and they're still fighting it legally to this day. John and Mark were confident that they had enough evidence to possibly prove that Isaiah really isn't the killer, that it had to be someone else. The unknown fingerprints, the DNA found on Leila's hair, the time of death being around close to noon, and Isaiah not having any cuts on his hands. So with all of that, they believed that Isaiah would walk out free. But in the end, Isaiah was found guilty again. According to the two, the evidence that got him convicted overall was his confession. The DA's theory of, well, if it wasn't Isaiah, who else could it be? The inconsistencies with Isaiah's story based on her version of the 911 call. And lastly, they believe that Isaiah had killed Leila at 10:45 a.m. when they were supposedly watching a movie. And this was all enough to convince the judge to find Isaiah guilty. Mark and John strongly believe that if this was a jury trial, the outcome would have been different. Now, let me give you a small backstory of the house that the Fowler family was living in. The house was a rental property. The previous renter was growing marijuana in the house, specifically in Leila's room. When the Fowler family moved in, they had to take down the tape that were on the windows, and the house reeked with pot. The police had information that the renter was not only growing and selling pot in the house, but selling firearms as well. However, the police never found any weapons in the house. The house was known to have many drug addicts showing up and going in and out all the time. At the time, Mark and John thought that there's a chance that one of the drug addicts came in looking for drugs or money because the house looked completely empty and then saw Leila and possibly freaked out. The "I know you're in here" Isaiah heard could have possibly meant for the renter that lived there, not for Leila or Isaiah. When asked about the neighbor who later recanted their statement, Mark mentions a man by the name of Anthony Gonzalez. Around 12 p.m. when police arrived, they asked the man who lived next door if he had seen anything, to which he says yeah, he saw a guy around 5'10", stocky build, gray hair, looked around in his 50s, Pendleton, jeans, and tennis shoes. The neighbor says he was crouched down from his window and saw the man running just 10-15 minutes ago when police had arrived, and that was it. According to John, immediately following the murder, the county sheriff received 2 phone calls, one from a woman and one from her counselor in a battered women's shelter in Calaveras County. The information they provided was that a year before the murder took place, a woman named Crystal, not the stepmother, who lived across the street from the Fowler family, was with her daughter, whose name is Leila. So, there's 2 Crystals and 2 Leilas. I know, I was confused for a moment when I heard John say it.
Lived a woman whose name was Crystal with her daughter Leila. Mm-hmm. The stepmother of the victim in our case is named Crystal. The victim is Leila.
So the other Crystal and Leila were hiding out in Valley Springs from a gangbanger in Los Angeles who threatened to kill her if she left the city while he was in jail. At the time of the murder, the man was on probation and in anger management class. The sheriff said that this man had signed out of his anger management class on the day Leila was killed. He signed out around 10 or 11 p.m. So it was impossible that he could have gone to Valley Springs himself, and the sheriffs were satisfied with that. John called the anger management facility and hoped that they could provide him with evidence of the man walking in and out of the building, or records of him signing out that day. The director says that they don't have any direct evidence that he was the one who signed out. The director admits to John that in all honesty, he could have left the building that night at any time, and that he had access to his cell phone at all time. This man didn't match the description given by Isaiah, as the woman running away from this man says he never had long hair, but that OGs in his gang down at Long Beach, California, all had long hair. The man's cell phone was never checked to see if he was communicating with anybody, but the police in Valley Springs didn't care, as they truly believed Isaiah was their suspect. If you remember the t-shirt that was found in Isaiah's laundry basket that had blood on it, well, it had a tiny speck of blood on the front. According to John, the blood was tested and had a combination of DNA for Leila and Isaiah. But on the back of the shirt, there was an imprint of some kind of object in blood, but they could never determine what the object could be. John continues to say that the blood on the shirt wasn't sprayed on. The police officer that found the shirt claimed that this was the shirt that Isaiah must have used in the murder, but John argues that they believe that the speck of blood was accidentally left by an officer who must have gotten Leila's blood on him. What makes this interesting to them is that how the officer was able to notice the tiny speck of blood on Isaiah's shirt in the laundry basket, but never reported the blood imprint on the back of it. If you remember earlier of the intern that EMT had mentioned, well, a year after Isaiah was convicted the second time, Mark and John got a hold of the intern. They asked him questions relating to the report he had filled out, to which the intern responds with, "Why didn't I come testify at the trial?" Both John and Mark were confused, and the intern continues to say, "Remember when you guys subpoenaed me to come testify?" Mark explains that they never did and that he's a defense attorney, not the district attorney, to which the intern says, "Oh, I got your subpoena from the trial." And when asked why he didn't show up, the intern says he was getting ready to head out there all the way from Reno, Nevada, but then got a call last minute to not show up, so he took the day off and didn't think about it since then. He thought Mark was the one who called him off, but it was in fact the DA who told him not to show up and testify. John mentions about a tip he received about a woman who was in rehab telling other people there, saying something along the lines of, "You know, my boyfriend killed that little girl and I helped him get rid of the weapon." And this boyfriend was a registered sex offender who was incarcerated in the county jail at the time for some violent act, according to John. But when they got a sample of his DNA, it didn't match the DNA found on Leila. This last piece of information is the most recent. Several months prior to this interview, Mark says that he received a letter from an inmate in federal custody looking at 15 years. In the letter, this inmate, who is from Stockton, says he had read about this case and says, "I cannot live with myself if I don't tell you the following. Back when this happened, I heard about it from the guys who said that Mr. Fowler had ripped off the Mexican mafia, so they said that we did his daughter because he ripped them off." This inmate provided names, dates, and numbers. Without revealing too much information, Mark says a lot of this inmate's stories and claims were able to be proven true. Stockton PD had received a call from an anonymous source making the same claim. John claims he has heard it from another woman who used to sell drugs from the Fowler's home, and her claim matches with the rest. Mark says there's more information that he can't reveal since they're still working on the case. When I made the last video, there was this legal battle whether Isaiah should be released at the age of 23 or 25. Well, it turns out Isaiah will be released at the age of 25, sometime in 2025. Isaiah is currently 21 years old as of now. As for Barney and the rest, I don't know how long they'll respond, or if they ever will. I don't even know if they will watch this video, but if they do ever respond, I'll make a community post if that ever happens, and leave a pinned comment on this video. In the same email where I sent them the questions, I included some of the nice comments you guys left for them. So, there we go. We reached to the end. Let me know what you guys think. Did your opinion change or did it remain the same? Let me know down in the comments below, as I'll be reading them. And please, go to the channel Cities of Blood and support them. Give the video a thumbs up. If it wasn't for them, this video wouldn't have been possible. Their channel will be linked down in the description below.